I'm joined today on the Bipartisan Brief by Doug Crandall, who has a fascinating background. He went to West Point and served our nation in the military, and then later was a graduate student at Stanford University and was very successful in the business world, and now is following his passion to be a teacher and a coach. And we're really happy to have him with us. And so my question is, Doug, you're in Washington State, and of course we've seen a lot of information lately about Seattle, with some say peaceful protesters, some say Antifa sort of taking over an area of downtown. And I've seen unbelievable conflicting information on this topic. And so my first question is, what are you seeing and hearing in terms of protests you've personally been to, in terms of people you know who've been in the downtown area? I'm very curious to get a firsthand account from a reliable source who really values, like myself, the truth a lot more than partisanship. So the floor is yours, my friend.
Yeah, Peter, thanks for having me. I went to a protest, I guess probably a week and a half ago, but it was, I'm outside of Seattle, so it was in a suburb, and that was a positive experience. One of my basketball players was there as well, and it was just it was good to be with her and supporting her. I mean, I have a big heart right now for everyone who's hurting because of what's going on. For Seattle itself, it's interesting. You know, I have not been down there personally, and some of the information, I'm getting some of the information, same information you are. I do have some Facebook friends who have gone down, and quite frankly, like people that you wouldn't expect. Like, I don't know everybody on Facebook. They're how they follow on things and whatnot, but I would say these are people from the suburbs, just describing it that way, going into downtown Seattle, into this area, Capitol Hill, that quite frankly is well known for sort of being a area of free expression, if you will. I don't know, that's kind of what's going on now, so that's the way I'd put it. That this is happening in Capitol Hill isn't a huge surprise to people around here. But my best assessment from seeing pictures on Facebook of some of these friends who described it as peaceful, and just the fact that they were down there, I actually think it's shifted pretty quickly. I think that this thing, when it first started, based on the response of our governor and our mayor and a few other things, seemed like it was a little bit out of control. I mean, that was the sense, and you know, the original signs, and on local news, things we saw were like, you're leaving the United States at this point. There were some initial reports about kind of law enforcement, vigilante law enforcement springing up. And I think some of those things had some legitimacy just from what I saw. But there was kind of this rebranding. I don't know how widespread it is across the country, but we've seen it here and on Twitter or whatever, from Chaz to Chop, from an autonomous zone to an occupied protest. And I think it has settled into this occupied protest, if you will, that is not what it seemed to be for the first few days of this. That's my impression.
So it kind of started off, because I kind of saw the same thing. I did see images and videos early on that looked like the videos I saw of Antifa in Minneapolis.
Right.
This broke out. And then I saw videos subsequently of people like square dancing and holding hands.
Yeah.
And we saw that evolution not just in Seattle, but to a large extent nationally. I know that another friend of mine I'm going to interview later today who flew to D.C. to participate in those protests. And this was after they had some problems there. This was after there was a protest that descended into what could be called a proper riot, with windows being broken arbitrarily and things of that nature. And then of course there was the issue of the famous photo op, and we still don't know the whole truth of that, but based on firsthand accounts, especially from members of the clergy who were there, which I generally find to be fairly reliable sources, it seems like there was rubber bullets and tear gas and that kind of thing. And then very soon thereafter, from what my friend said, he was posting sort of ironically, check out the riot. And it was a little black kid and a little white kid dancing.
Mm-hmm.
And so we clearly saw things that crossed the line into objectionable territory. But it also seems like it's hard to say. So as a raw number, probably not isolated, but maybe as a percent, clearly in the minority of things that arguably cross the line into objectionable territory. Is that kind of similar what you're saying locally and nationally?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think, one thing that crosses my mind, the biggest problem with, no, I'd say the biggest, because that's an unfair way to put it. One problem with any of the things that we're going through is the objectification of people, right? I mean, and that just power, like I study power a lot, and leaders who have power tend to objectify people. It's almost impossible not to in certain ways. And by that, I mean, like if you're leading a large military unit, it's hard to think of every single individual. Like we have to protect our own emotions, and then people become the objects of the things we're trying to implement. It's a long way of saying with any of these, there are people, whether we want to call them protests or riots, when property is being destroyed, when people are dying. Like, I mean, the thing about George Floyd, if you will, is it's so heart-wrenching because it was so human, like there's no objectification there. We can see this horrible thing happening to a human being, and that is gut-wrenching. But if you look at something like Chaz or Chop, I think it's gotten better, but there are still property owners. There are still people whose businesses who can't run their businesses. I mean, and there's so much of that going on right now that it requires all of us to step back and be as just empathetic and rational as we can be with all the emotions that are going on. When you throw in the virus and all the businesses, that people that are losing their businesses and the people that are dying, and all these balancing act of just wading through all the things that are happening, it's just hard. Like, it requires us to be understanding. So I say all that to say, yes, I think you're right. I think there are not these crazy things happening, but there are still, I think this 6-block area has changed, and there are still some people who live there who can't go, who can't live in their house safely, if you will, because it's been overtaken or something, for lack of a better way of putting it.
Help me understand Chaz and Chop. These are not terms I'm familiar with.
Oh, sorry. So yeah, Capitol Hill is the CH in both of them. So Capitol Hill is a little bit west of downtown Seattle proper, like I-5, Interstate 5 kind of cuts through Seattle, and on the left side you've got things the left or west side, you've got the Space Needle and CenturyLink Field and Safeco Field. On the west side of I-5 are some neighborhoods. The University of Washington is kind of north and west. So Capitol Hill is kind of on the southwestern side of Washington. So the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, when it started off,
that's Capitol Autonomous Zone. Got it.
Yeah, it was Chaz. And this was you are leaving the United States now. We are going to abolish police in this 6-block area. We are going to start a new form of living, of government. Was kind of the original few days of this. And it was driven, I think, a little bit by it was driven by whatever Antifa is, or whoever, this type of thinking. It changed, kind of morphed, and it was almost like a rebranding. I don't know who's leading the strategy, but to Capitol Hill occupied protest. So we're no longer saying we're establishing a new country inside the United States. We're protesting for now. We're occupying, kind of like we occupied Wall Street. We're occupying Capitol Hill, and we are using that to understand each other. There's a lot of graffiti. There's no question about that. Some of it is very artistic. An enormous Black Lives Matter sort of mural was painted on the street. I've seen pictures of that. It looks very peaceful. It's beautiful. It's good art. And then there are other F the police things all over the place, right? So there's sort of all kinds of things going on. And at the same
it sounds like you're, like the rest of us, trying to make sense of this. Because on one hand, it's very simple. An unarmed, defenseless Black man was murdered. And it's not the first time we've seen it. And of course, you have the related, connected cultural issues of nonviolent but unconstitutional police harassment that may be tied into these things, which is also disproportionately affects Black people. And at the same time, we saw a lot of people with their own agenda using this moment to advance something that had nothing to do with racial justice. And so I certainly found myself, and I think that I'm probably in the majority of people who felt disgust at what happened to George Floyd and others, and also Martin Luther King Jr. said that the riot is the voice of the voiceless. So when I saw genuinely emotionally distraught Black people arbitrarily breaking windows, I did not feel upset toward those Black people. When I saw white kids with skateboards doing the same thing, I found myself feeling like, I'm not so sure that you're part of the protest. I feel like you're co-opting the protest for your own purposes, and to a very real extent, framing Black people. Because we both know that the media on either side of the political spectrum is going to run with their own narrative. And so, for example, if you turn on Fox News, you and I have both seen images on independent networks of white people in Arizona looting sneaker stores.
Yeah.
But on Fox News, you're really only going to see the Black people coming out with arms full of things. And then on an MSNBC, you're only going to see instances of unprovoked police brutality, like knocking members of the media down with the shield and things like that. And I don't mean to equate or draw any sort of equivalence between window breaking and looting versus police brutality, because of course police officers are in a position of much greater authority and they're supposed to be well trained. Yet it is very frustrating seeing the various media narratives that are more agenda driven than truth driven. And I'm curious to know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I think you describe it really well. I feel the same way as you do in almost everything you described, in the sense that the justifiable hurt and anger didn't bother me personally when it ended up in rioting or looting, because it was coming from a real place of brokenness, right? Like, so I get that. And I think what you've seen, my personal take, and again, this is my personal take, maybe just being a little bit closer to it, what you've seen in this Chaz versus Chop is that the first part, Chaz, was a co-opting of this agenda, right? Like, it was, we're creating this 6-block thing, and now a lot of the talk is about, regardless of how you feel about these issues, it was about different issues. It was about democratic socialism versus capitalism, and signs there that said people over property, which weren't necessarily referring to anything but a different sort of political agenda. And I think, like I said, there was almost a rebranding to where the Chop, the Occupy protest, now seems to be a lot more about the issue at hand, which is that Black Lives Matter. So, I mean, that, and I think I'd agree with your media narrative as well. I personally, every day, go to like 5 different sites, and I include Fox News in that, because I find news there that you can't find other places. And then I go to ABC, and then I go to CNN, and even USA Today, which doesn't quite tend to be as deep, but you can find some different articles there. So I think that those narratives and those agendas drive so much of it, and the more we seek out the information that confirms what we want to believe, like, the less educated and informed we're going to be for it. So I think what your stuff like this that you're doing here is great. We need to listen to everybody we can.
Yeah, that's the purpose of this show, is to hear from different perspectives, and also to try to present things objectively, like the piece we did on the Supreme Court in episode 1, where there's this feeling that the Supreme Court reflects the hyperpartisanship of our nation. But if you actually look at the numbers, it's something like 70% of the cases are 9-0 decisions. And good luck finding Congress to unanimously vote on anything. So, yeah. And what's also fascinating about studying the Supreme Court is that we're seeing some very strange bedfellows. Like, for example, the Supreme Court just turned down a chance to review qualified immunity. And the 2 justices who spoke up and said we should review this. And for those watching who don't know, qualified immunity says the police can't be sued for brutality or held liable unless the circumstances are essentially precisely the same as previous cases that have been technically ruled as quote unquote brutality. And of course, the circumstances are almost never exactly the same, right? If a police releases a Rottweiler, that's not viewed precisely the same as a German Shepherd, as an example. And the two justices that wanted to review this were Justice Sotomayor and Justice Thomas.
Huh.
And so you talk about strange bedfellows. And you see these things with Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. Alito and Thomas pretty much vote ideologically right 100% of the time. And then Kagan and Breyer and Ginsburg also kind of vote partisanly, if that's an adverb, virtually 100% of the time. But Sotomayor and Gorsuch and Kavanaugh and Roberts have all proven in their own way to be independent swing voter type folks, which to me is very encouraging. And I want to shift a little bit because you talked about branding, Chaz versus Chop.
Yeah.
And we see, and this is my own opinion, and even though I am a bipartisan independent, I'm known to criticize both sides here and there. And I've noticed that the liberals are not so good at branding. For example, Chaz, we're going to secede from America and start our own socialist haven. Probably not such a good brand. And I compare the liberal brand that's popular right now, defund the police, with the conservative brand that's popular right now, law and order. And now you and I, as students of history, and you, correct me if I'm wrong, you were a history professor at West Point, or was it a different subject?
It was organizational behavior, yeah.
Okay. But you're certainly a student of history.
Sure, yeah,
So
absolutely.
you know that the law and order brand began as the Barry Goldwater led FU to the civil rights movement. That's where that brand began. And so consequently, I find it to be a troubling brand, but it's a powerful brand. Who's in favor of chaos,
right,
and destruction, and criminals running free? And then you look at defund the police on the other hand, and it's like, well, who thinks we should literally strip all funding of the police and live life in America without policing whatsoever? Now, that's not exactly what that brand actually means, and yet it's what that brand indicates. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that. Like when you probably looked into it a lot more and realized that they're actually calling for things like shifting some money from the militarization aspects of policing to expanding the wellness checkup units, right? Like if a mother has a bipolar son, she calls 911 because he's really having a difficult moment. To have a trained wellness professional show up rather than a police officer just makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
And the chief of police in Dallas several years ago pointed out, and he's right. He said, we're being counted on for way too many things that we're not trained for and that shouldn't properly be our place. But you have so many other things that have actually been defunded. Like, for example, when Lyndon Johnson was president, there were nearly 750,000 beds for people who were severely mentally unwell that were federally funded. Today, even though the population has more than doubled, I think the number's all the way down into like the 30,000 range. And so you look at the young man in the Connecticut town that's escaping my brain right now, where the mass shooting happened at the.
Oh yeah.
It wasn't Stony Brook.
It's escaping my brain right now too. It was Newtown was the town, but Sandy Hook was the
Sandy Hook. So the incident at Sandy Hook, if that single mother had access to a federally funded room for people who are clearly severely mentally unwell, then perhaps Sandy Hook doesn't happen. And so I'm curious to know your thoughts on defund the police, since you've looked into more what they actually mean. And I'm sure it's not a brand you love, but what are your thoughts on some of the reforms they're calling for? And then a two-part question, because my guess is that being a West Point grad who served our nation militarily, I'm guessing you probably have at least a couple of friends around the country who are currently law enforcement officials. And we've seen a lot of public statements from the chiefs And I'm curious to know your thoughts and their thoughts on defund the police, but also their thoughts generally on what's happening.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I was watching, I happened to catch a little bit of Trevor Noah last night, and he used a really interesting phrase. He says, we all go to our battle stations, right? Like when these things happen. And I think that's the problem. And so when you look at a brand, I have looked into defund the police. It's interesting when you say they, and I'm not trying to pick on you, Peter, but like cadets used to say this when I taught them a lot. And when we say they, it's like, well, let's qualify who they is, because there are people like my first response to defund the police was, okay, well, words matter, and defund means this. It means defund. And then you went to Minneapolis, and you had the first like kind of visuals I saw of this, which were these people clamoring and shaming the mayor for not actually saying he would abolish the police. So the initial branding was terrible. And then we did have whoever they are, come out and try to qualify. We're not, for the most part, we're not talking about getting rid of police. Although in Chaz they were to start, so all these messages are coming at us. But we go to our battle stations, and I think I do have friends that are police officers who over the last couple of years have talked about some of the stuff they do now, and it's not what they signed up to do. So the concept makes a ton of sense. I mean, I saw Trevor Noah was talking about just in Atlanta, if we'd had somebody different than armed police officers show up to help this guy that was asleep in his car, the whole thing might be different. Like we had different people responding to this. So the idea that like when you talk about history, that we've gone way overboard on militarizing the police and all these things, I think of course we should look at all that. Why do we start with words like and hashtags and memes like defund the police that then send people to their battle station? So my buddy, what if it had been rebranded as like support the police, by having other people do the jobs that they don't want to do? Like they would have bought into that message. I'm not arguing like we can be perfect in everything we do. It's just, I think even more so than branding, like how do we avoid going to these places that are confrontational, because we need to solve the problems. This is a little bit off topic of what you said, but it's kind of along this idea of words mattering. I'm not a fan right now, and I might be the only guy. And it's hard to say. I was telling my wife this last night. Like you don't want to say things right off the bat because you want people to listen to what you're saying. Like I want to have conversations. I'm not a fan right now of the word systemic racism. Now, as soon as I say that, there will be people that brace. But like, well, let me explain why I'm saying that. Because I think system is the wrong word. This is just me. I could be wrong. Let's have a conversation. I think we've fixed a lot of our systems. Like systemically, the laws on the books are equal now. Like the way we go about college admissions are equal. We fix the systems. We still have an enormous problem. I'm by no means saying that we don't have a racist structural problem with racism. But we don't need to change systems. We need to change culture. Like we need to change, and cultural change is so different from changing systems. And that's kind of a goofy play on words, but I think it's an important discussion, like what we call things, how we say things, whether we say defund versus whether we are talking about actually changing resources and putting them and investing in them in other ways while maintaining the police department's core mission, get them back to their core mission and take all these other services and invest in different solutions for those services. It's such a different message than defund. I think I understand the way people are using system now. Like they're talking about culture and they're talking about structural inequalities that have resulted from historically racist systems. But I don't know. I'm just I'm kind of particular about words.
Well, so as you know, I wrote a book on the topic of racism, and in a vacuum and on paper versus in reality.
Yeah.
It's very different things. So for example, the Montgomery GI Bill on paper was non-discriminatory.
Right.
On paper, they made it clear that Black World War II veterans deserved the same benefits as any other group of veterans. And yet in practice, for example, in New York City, these numbers aren't exactly right. They're ballpark. I can't recall the exact figures off the top of my head, but there were something like 400,000 government-backed Montgomery GI Bill mortgages issued to white World War II veterans in New York State alone, and there were around 100 issued to black World War II veterans. And so you're right that on paper in a vacuum, we don't have systemic racism as things are written. The problem is that as they're practiced, a lot of times we go astray. Like, you may or may not be aware that in 2011, Bank of America had to pay a $335 million fine because Department of Justice investigation revealed that they were systemically treating identically qualified borrowers differently based on race, with black borrowers being asked to pay higher interest, with black borrowers being lent less money, with black borrowers being denied. Or, for example, in 2007, the Mississippi State Supreme Court ordered a study on the extent to which prosecutors continue to whitewash juries, particularly if there's a black defendant and a white victim. And that study, and of course, we shouldn't be surprised to know that the Mississippi State Supreme Court is not exactly some, Ivy League bastion of liberalism. And they found the practice was still utterly rampant. And that's 21 years after Batson versus Kentucky ruled whitewashing of juries unconstitutional. And really rather shocking that we didn't even rule that unconstitutional until 86.
True. Yep.
And so there's so much overlap between individual racism and institutional or systemic racism. And so to a very real extent, is if the people with their fingers on the power levers struggle with individual racism, then no matter what the rules say, it's pretty likely that we're going to continue to see quite serious problems, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, and I think, and again, I love the conversation because I don't bring it up to argue with any of it. I really don't. I think that's like, look at a Matar Berry. Like, there's nothing down there in Georgia that says those guys shouldn't have been investigated, arrested. In my opinion, I'm no legal expert, but prosecuted right away, right? Like, when that happened, they should have been arrested, prosecuted. They weren't, not because on the books in Georgia, like, that's okay, but because you've got some racism. I don't want to indict whoever the individuals are, or maybe just cronyism. I don't know what it was in that case, but it's wrong. Like, we all know it's wrong. But it's wrong because people with their, like you said, on the hands on the buttons of power are still acting out in racist ways. And so I'm not trying to get in the way of any of what we're doing, like with my goofy little Doug Crandall thoughts that don't mean that much. Ultimately, we've got to change culture, and there's nothing harder in the world of leadership than changing culture. And we've changed it to some extent. And a lot of times culture change follows changes in laws and changes in systems. Like, we all think, we don't even think about wearing seatbelts anymore. We change culture through laws. And now it's just a no-brainer. Like, that's where we have to get to change this culture. But I think we will be more effective. I just personally think we'll be more effective, those who are trying to do this important work, if we focus on culture change, because there are specific, well-studied ways to change culture. That changing systems are a part of changing culture, but changing culture is a bigger task.
And so I don't disagree with what you're saying. And I can tell you that the most important recommendation, and as coaches, of course, we're going to recognize this, the best way to change culture is through accountability.
Yeah, for sure.
The lack of accountability is the real systemic problem. $335 million did not cause Bank of America real pain.
Yeah.
Because they profited over $6 billion that quarter. And so they've been fined multiple times since 2011 in the tens of millions of dollar range for the same exact thing.
Right.
And so just as if you say, would you please box out?
Yeah.
Or if you write down, here are our team standards, and boxing out is one of them.
Sure.
Well, maybe they do, maybe they won't. But if you make them do 10 push-ups every single time, they don't box out.
Yeah.
And so what's so hard to change the culture inside of a system. And I'm willing to accept your distinction that the problem's not the system in a vacuum. The problem is the culture that colors between the lines of the system.
Well,
the problem is who wants to be held accountable.
Yeah.
And so I'm like what they're doing in Minneapolis right now, what they did in Camden, is what they're essentially saying is we're going to tear it down and reopen it under a different authority in order to work around the unions because we can't hold police officers accountable because the unions are too strong.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with the Camden experience? I know you got to run here in a second, but
yeah, I am. Yep.
I thought that, and again, the culture, it's like a lot of the police officers I know feel like they won't verbalize it necessarily, but they feel like we can't protect anyone unless we protect each other first.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a culture, the blue wall of silence.
For sure.
The reason Frank Serpico is so famous is because there aren't very many like him. And I interviewed a black police officer in Dallas, and he says that still happens. If you're a rabble rouser who's pushing for reform from within, you call for backup, and the backup doesn't arrive.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, of course, that's not written down on paper in the system.
Yeah.
And yet, to your point, it's a cultural issue. And so, last things, I know you got to run. I really appreciate your time. Because we're seeing, like, I always want to feel hopeful. And of course, it's super easy to feel hopeful as a white man,
Yeah.
But in seeing hundreds of police chiefs put out statements, I've never seen that before.
Mm-hmm.
And seeing NASCAR say no more Confederate flag.
Sure.
And seeing the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, I don't think that's the exact right term, he came out and expressly said, Black Lives Matter. It's a Christian imperative to recognize that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm seeing all sorts of public progress, but I'm curious, and of course, without naming names, what are you hearing privately from your friends in law enforcement? How open are they, scale of 1 to 10, to reform, or do they feel just frankly picked on at this moment? Or is it a little bit of a mixed bag?
Yeah, good question. I'll answer that. I just want to say one thing about what you said about the problem with the system is accountability. I love that phrase. And I just bring it up because conversations like these, we all learn from, right? Like, so I'm not trying to be right. I'm trying to say what I think and listen. And I learned something new just from hearing that. So I think that is true. Like, if we're going to fix systems, let's fix our systems of accountability. Anyway, just the point being that as we do process these things together, like, we all can learn from them. And I've changed my, perspective on it a little bit just from listening to you. But I think right now, quite frankly, primarily police officers feel beat down, right? Like, and that's, they're human. I think they need to come to grips with what you just said, like, and create a culture of accountability, because the problem in a lot of ways is the unwillingness to stop those who are doing harm from doing harm. So I'm not giving a pass, but I do think we're not at the point, like, because it was defund the police. So a lot of them are just saying, yeah, try it and see what happens, because they're taking it literally, and it would be impossible not to not have your job question that you got into, to try to, at least the friends I have, great people who are trying to do the right thing, that were already dealing with like a bunch of crap in terms of having to do jobs that they didn't sign up to do, showing up to overdoses and things like that. This really wasn't what I got into policing to do. I got into protect people. So take all that, and now the message they're hearing is defund the police. And I think a lot of them are like, fine. I shouldn't say a lot of them. The ones I know, try it, because they feel like they've been punched in the gut a little bit by everything that's going on. That's not to throw a victim mentality out there. Like, I think the friends I've talked to get, this makes us, we should all be offended by this. We should all be horrified by the things that are going on. but we're all human. And so trying to process all these things now is not exactly the time that I think most police on the front lines are ready to hear. They're just trying to survive right now with throw in their 15-hour days and having bottles thrown at them and things like that. It's just a hard moment right now for them as well. And that's, I'll be honest, Peter, like that's a hard thing to say on Facebook, right? Like I was the best man at a guy's wedding who's a police officer, and we grew up together, and he's a great guy, and he called me like hurting, like last Saturday, just what's going on in the world. I could tell he just wanted me to tell him I still love him, So on both sides, like friends of color who are hurting, that's 100% real, and it's incredibly important, and it's probably more important, quite frankly. But my buddy still, is important as well. And so I just hope we get through it all, like with the hope that you have, and get to the point where we are having conversations and making progress. Because I do agree with you that right now is different for sure.
Well, and so the next time you talk to your buddy, if you feel like using a college sports analogy, when an athletic department is in trouble, they will often put forth their own self-reported, self-disciplinary measures.
Sure.
And I think that if police would put forth their own reforms, that would really make a difference, because it sounds like, and I have friends in law enforcement as well. Like I said, I interviewed, the friend of mine in Dallas, and of course he reported, frankly, terribly disturbing information. If you push for reform from the inside, your backup calls don't arrive. Still, in 2020. Yeah. And so if there would be some level of consensus from the police that that we do need to reform ourselves, right? That we are, especially in this specific realm, very much part of the problem.
Yeah.
I don't want to say 100% of the problem, especially because I know we have problems outside of this area as well. It would be really nice if police unions came out with legitimate reform ideas that essentially said, you know what, we have been part of the problem, and now we intend to be a major part of the solution. I think that really changes the narrative. And we can talk a lot more about this. I wrote an entire 2 chapters in my book, one on individual, one on group solutions. And the smallest things, like the other day, there was a cop in Houston who saw a bunch of black kids with one of their coaches doing summer strength stuff. He just went and bought a couple cases of Gatorade.
Yeah.
Showed up and said, keep working hard, fellas. Hope you're doing well. Like, that's a really impactful moment.
For sure.
And so, like, I would love to see there be charitable wings in police departments where police officers have petty cash to pay an occasional light bill of a struggling mother who's out of work.
Yeah.
Or to buy a couple of kids a candy bar here and there.
Sure.
Because there is a tremendous amount of mistrust that black people feel toward the police. And as a student of history, I'm sure you'd agree that this mistrust is not misplaced.
No, no way.
And so it would be wonderful if the police would step forward with aggression and have personal accountability and say, yes, we collectively have been part of the problem, and now we're going to do whatever we can to be a major part of the solution. So anyway, Doug Crandall, my friend.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's good to see you.
And I look forward to talking more in the future.
All right. Thanks, Peter.
Doug.